Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants of International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure 2021 in the last session of the second day of the conference. My name is Sandeep Pondrik and I am the Director General of CDRI. We are ending the day with this session. We started the day with a similar session on small island developing states of Pacific region. After that, we have had sessions on digital resilience, urban resilience, and innovations and emerging technologies. In the session on small island developing states of Pacific region, we discussed critical challenges and opportunities before the small island developing states and how to address them. We got a lot of quotes from the discussion, and some of my favorites are that states are in a constant state of recovery, that Pacific has proven its resilience despite its vulnerabilities, and the last but not the least, beautifully said that the countries in Pacific should not be called states but BOS as big ocean states because they are the custodian of one of the largest oceans or the largest ocean of the world. We also discussed issues like capacity building, the requirement of flexibility in funding, and also that the self-reliance of the countries rather than depending on external aid. As 8 of the 10 countries with the highest multi-disaster risk relative to their economic shock are from the Caribbean, we can say that Caribbean small island developing states are one of the most vulnerable countries or states in the world. The session will discuss the issues related to disaster and climate resilience related to states. And now, let me hand over the session to the session moderator, Mr. Ronald Jackson. Mr. Jackson heads the Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery Team for building resilience in the UNDP. His 7 years as Executive Director of Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency or CDEMA, he has shown exemplary service. Mr. Jackson also served as the Director General of Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica. So he is an expert on matters related to Caribbean. Over to you, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Sir Pondrik. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Regional Forum for Small Island Developing States, the Caribbean SIDS, and certainly in listening to the summary of this morning's session, the idea that SIDS should be called BOS certainly something that will resonate with our Caribbean colleagues. As you would have heard from Sandre, the ICDRI was launched in 2019 by the Honorable Prime Minister of India at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is a global multi-stakeholder platform led and managed by national governments, UN agencies, multilateral banks, financing mechanisms, private sector, and knowledge institutions. It seeks to promote resilience of infrastructure systems to climate and disaster risk, thereby ensuring sustainable development. This Caribbean Regional Forum is being convened against the backdrop of the devastating events which have impacted the countries within the last decade. We note also that the COVID-19 has presented new challenges for critical infrastructure, especially those in the health and telecommunications sector. And the signal that we are likely to face a warmer world will present future challenges under the current context. Considering that SIDS has a propensity for disaster and climate risk, investing in resilient infrastructure can reap long-term benefits and provide the needed impetus for resilient development. In this regard, the session will lay out the critical challenges and opportunities for adopting resilient pathways for infrastructure development in SIDS. For participants, we're going to encourage you that as we go through the panel discussions this afternoon, that you post your questions in the Zoom chat box, and we will pick them from there and share them with our panel. We've assembled today a very distinguished panel of representatives who will give perspectives on the issue of Caribbean infrastructure resilience from a variety of angles, ranging from financing to disaster risk to infrastructure standards. But before we hear from those distinguished speakers, we have the pleasure of being joined by Ambassador Douglas Slater, who is the Assistant Secretary General of CARICOM. Dr. Slater is a national of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and a medical doctor by profession. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade and Consumer Affairs of St. Vincent from 2010 to 2013. In that capacity, he also served as representative of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the ACT-EU Parliamentarian Group and as an alternate for the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance on the Caribbean Development Bank and Eastern Caribbean Central Bank Authority. Dr. Slater served as a Minister of Health and Environment for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and he was the CARICOM Minister of Health designated to negotiate the regional approach to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Dr. Slater also was honored by the Caribbean Community Secretariat as one of the CARICOM's first champions for change. As Minister of Environment, Dr. Slater was actively involved in the UN climate change and sustainable development negotiations at the political and technical level, leading discussions on renewable energy who are the critical factors for sustainable economic development. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Slater has served in many capacities within the health sector and also in several countries across the Caribbean, most notable his time in Jamaica. And so it makes him certainly a true ambassador of CARICOM and quite apt to speak on this issue of critical infrastructure resilience. Dr. Slater, welcome, and I yield the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Donald. Mr. Ronald Jackson, Head, Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery Team, United Nations Development Program, based in Geneva, Switzerland, and moderator. Mr. Derek Omar, Chief Executive Officer, CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, CROSSQ. Mr. Isaac Anthony, Chief Executive Officer, CCRIF SPC, which is formerly the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. Ms. Andrea Governor, Deputy Executive Director, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. Participants. Let me start by conveying my gratitude on behalf of Ambassador Owen Larrock, the Secretary General of Caribbean Community, CARICOM, to the Government of India for their vision in establishing and advancing the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. Let me also take a moment to commend all the partners who have contributed to and hosted the previous webinars in the build-up to this conference. It may be a bit of an understatement in saying that 2020 has been an extremely challenging year globally, affecting every region and every nation. Our infrastructure and systems have been stress tested unlike any other time in recent history, with a potent combination of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, worsening climate impacts, and turbulent geopolitical events of various forms. In Latin America and the Caribbean, and especially for us in CARICOM, dealing with extreme climatic disasters are becoming an annual expectation. Since 2014, we have seen on an increasing basis natural disasters and regional emergencies that have forced us to readjust the parameters of extremes against which we plan for our development. 2017 was particularly devastating when we saw 100% of the populations of the Commonwealth of Dominica and the island of Barbuda impacted by major hurricanes Maria and Irma, with up to 95% of the building stock damaged on those two islands. The initial post-Maria needs assessment conducted by Dominica estimated US $1.3 billion damages, equivalent to 226% of the GDP. Recovery costs were estimated at 1.37 billion US dollars. According to the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, UNECLAC, infrastructure damage, loss and additional costs in the British Virgin Islands alone in the aftermath of hurricane were $455 million, approximately 20% of total costs. Damages in the region were dominated by severe washouts of critical river crossings, and losses comprised the cost of restoring road access, clearing debris, and restoring river capacity, as well as traffic delays and income losses to transport service providers. The recovery strategy focused on restoring safe operations to damaged assets and to replacing major bridges and critical crossings with high resilience. The total recovery costs were assessed to be $300 million US dollars. Experiences and lessons are plentiful, and much has been done to improve. However, the experience in 2019 with Hurricane Dorian humbled us once more and re-energized the urgency for substantial investments in resilience at all levels. While the region is still recovering from these historic events, we have had to weather the worst pandemic in 100 years. This time, the entire international community is affected, and as usual, SIDS and least developed countries are hit the hardest. Nevertheless, the region was proactive and was lauded for the quick and decisive leadership in responding, but had to quickly readjust to prepare for an Atlantic storm season that saw record-breaking numbers of named storms. This served as a grim preview of what a 2-degree plus future will look like, while slow onset climate impacts like drought and sea level rise quietly continues to tighten their grip on our islands. It gets worse, because through these struggles and clear evidence, we still find ourselves having to increase our advocacy for fairness in criteria and eligibility for access to concessional finance and development assistance that would allow us to weather and service these multiple shocks. Dear participants, this is a sample of the grim context of CARICOM's reality in climate and disaster resilience. Challenges that are no doubt shared in many regions of the world, making partnerships like this one supremely vital to our collective development process. The CARICOM region has been continuously adapting and progressively weaving resilience into our central development agenda. There has been no way around it. A sustainable development agenda for Caribbean states is a resilience development agenda. 226% GDP loss for a major hurricane in a few hours for a single country is unsustainable and deleterious by any metric. CARICOM member states, in partnership with the CARICOM regional institutions, articulated and have been implementing the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy 2014 to 2024. It is a wide suite of strategic initiatives to improve upon all aspects of the disaster management cycle and in response to a multitude of hazards that affect the region. Following the passage of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, CARICOM articulated a Caribbean pathway for resilience, seeking to provide a clear vision for resilience-centric development. Heads of Government of CARICOM in 2018 approved the approach with its 5 pillars. 1, social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable. 2, enhancing economic opportunities. 3, safeguarding infrastructure. 4, environmental protection. And 5, operational readiness and recovery. The thematic areas of the CDRI align neatly with the pillars and enabling elements of the Caribbean pathway for resilience, especially our commitment to safeguard infrastructure and enhance operational readiness and recovery. As I reflect on the multitude of recent hazards, we should note that our region has a unique opportunity now to integrate a green post-COVID recovery with our increased ambition to adapt to climate impacts and limit emissions to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels as per the Paris Agreement. As we move forward in improving our social and financial systems and our physical infrastructure, elements such as continuity, robust multi-hazard risk modeling, trust in the science, and harmony with nature must all become more central in our planning and execution of rebuilding efforts. Considering this recognition, ladies and gentlemen, by means of sharing experiences, permit me to mention a few initiatives in the disaster resilient infrastructure in the Caribbean community that are noteworthy. One, the region has advanced work to enhance and adopt the Caribbean Uniform Building Code, acronym CUBIC, along with increased advocacy and enforcement around adherence to codes and their interpretation. Also, in 2018, the Council for Trade and Economic Development, COTED, approved the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, which is a CROSSQ approved standard with the support from the Caribbean Development Bank. Two, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Site Center, or 5Cs, with the EU Global Climate Change Alliance support, is assisting the CARIFORUM countries in developing standard operating procedures for climate change adaptation in water utilities. Three, the 5Cs is also preparing a green procurement manual and toolkit for good practice in retrofitting public buildings. Four, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, has been overseeing the development of a model national recovery framework to assist member states in creating or updating their legal and policy framework regarding disaster recovery. We will no doubt hear more about these given the composition and expertise of the panel. But despite these and other excellent examples of resilience enabling initiatives, we are faced and will continue to face specific constraints. Most importantly, major investments in critical infrastructure are needed to substantially build on this resilience pathway. CARICOM members, like many other SIDS, find themselves in peculiar positions of being the most in need of concessional financing and seemingly with the most hurdles to qualify for development financing on fair terms. The issues of capacity development, access to emerging technologies, and the need to scale up community-based approaches continue to require our urgent attention. I cannot stress enough that there must be frank discussions in the appropriate fora to examine the pledges and commitments made, the barriers to concessional financing, and the capacity gaps of SIDS in submitting proposals to advance their resilience. These discussions are critical to accompany and complement the excellent technical work in adaptation and resilience already ongoing in the region. In closing, I take the opportunity to urge all partners to candidly share their experiences, knowing that our challenges are the same and our vision is one. We will continue to advocate for financial, technical, and capacity building support for our member states in building their resilience. Accelerated flow of climate finance will go a long way in this regard. The Caribbean community has been and will continue to advocate for global collaboration for recovery, resilience, risk finance, and insurance for poor and vulnerable populations in the face of climate and disaster risk. I therefore look forward to the dialogue, partnerships, and actions that will no doubt be catalyzed from this forum and other initiatives of the coalition since it will allow us to improve our overall resilience and advocacy. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slater. I want to highlight a few very important points that I think came out of your keynote address. In particular, you highlighted the multidimensional nature of the challenges facing Caribbean cities, and in particular, the stress that is placing on achieving infrastructure sustainability. Particularly, it was drawn to the thought you presented around the need to rethink the parameters of extremes against which we are planning and designing, but also the central role that infrastructure plays in fast-tracking post-crisis recovery within the Caribbean context. You made a call on the need to address this issue of concessional financing, which I think is certainly impacting the Caribbean's efforts to compete against the impact that nature and or current development trajectory presents. And of course, the cyclical nature of the main threats that the region faces, namely climate extremes, hurricanes, and extreme rainfall events. But more importantly, I think we signal the Caribbean rising to the challenge by placing resilience at the center of its development agenda, and inclusive of the resilience pathway which you outlined, and certainly outlined some of the critical principles for building back better or building forward better, as they are saying post-COVID. Thank you, Dr. Slater. Our next set of panelists, we want to save enough time to hear from them because I think they're going to unpack many of the things that Dr. Slater spoke to. And we're going to go through a series of 3 rounds under 3 specific themes. 1, looking at challenges, 2, looking at solutions, and 3, looking at methodologies or approaches against these particular challenges and identified solutions. We're going to hear from 3 key sectoral speakers, 1 looking at building standards, 1 looking at the financial sector, sort of the regional financing sector and how they are mobilizing their resources around supporting infrastructure development, and 1 looking at what I would call a very innovative approach to risk financing. And then we will hear from Andrea Grosvenor, who will serve as our discussant, who will try to sum up all of what you would have heard from the different speakers and to bring the context, I think, within the frame of the strategy and resilience pathway that you would have heard Dr. Slater speak to. So, dear panelists, please forgive me if I don't go into details in introducing you, but I want to really save time for our participants to hear from you. Our first panelist is Mr. Derek Omar. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Regional Organization for Standards Quality. We refer to it as CROSSQ, and it's headquartered in Barbados. He has a focus on modernizing and accelerating the preparation of adoption and applications of regional standards, metrology, accreditation, and conformity assessment systems to increase trade, boost industrial efficiency and effectiveness, and advance quality-conscious culture among the citizens, and to advance the CARICOM single market economy in that regard. Our second panelist is Daniel Best. He's the Director of Projects in the Projects Department, at the Caribbean Development Bank, also headquartered in Barbados. In this role, he's accountable for the management, pipeline development, appraisal, and implementation of the bank's lending and technical assistance programs across multiple sectors. I do believe Daniel is also an engineer. So you'll be able to not only speak to the sort of development projects from the banking sector, but maybe touch on some of the engineering issues as well. Our third speaker, Mr. Isaac Anthony, is the CEO of CRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which holds the distinction of being the world's first multi-country risk pool providing parametric insurance to the Caribbean and Central America. He has over 25 years of senior management experience in the public finance and financial sector and economic planning. He also served as the permanent secretary for finance and economic affairs for the government of St. Lucia. And then we will hear from Andrea Grosvenor, who is the Deputy Executive Director for the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, a humanitarian with a passion for helping people and managing disaster risk, which she's devoted her career to for more than 20 years. We're going to start with our first round of questions, and I'll pose the first one to Mr. Omar. And I'm giving you 4 minutes, sir. With your experience of working in the Caribbean region, what are the climate and disaster risk critical infrastructure systems? What climate and disaster risk are critical infrastructure systems exposed to? And according to you, what are the drivers of vulnerability that perpetuate these risks within the Caribbean region?
Thanks, Ron. Good morning, or good night, or good afternoon to everybody. For us at CrossView, the critical infrastructure systems that we see in the Caribbean are the utility sector, the building sector, not only commercial buildings, but homes, and then finally the transportation and communication sector, which would be ICT, roads, bridges, and other such accessibility infrastructure. That critical infrastructure systems, or those critical infrastructure systems, we see are mostly affected right now by earthquakes and hurricanes. On our doorstep, however, we recognize there are rising sea level issues and drought issues. And now we even have a little semi-active volcano kicking up. So CrossView has gone through an analysis of looking at these disaster risk areas with CDIMA and also with CDB. And one of the things we have come up with is that the critical driver of vulnerability that perpetuates these natural disaster and climate risk for us appears to be ineffective implementation of national infrastructure standards and codes, and particularly ineffective implementation of national building codes that a lot of member states have. And it doesn't matter whether member states are trying to implement it compulsory or on a voluntary compliance basis. We think that there is insufficient implementation capacities and will to get it done. Now, in terms of the ineffective implementation of national infrastructure codes and standards, we honestly believe that this implementation deficit is driven by two things. One is the lack of a sustained government will to just get it done, and the other one is a lack of a national coordinating committee for the agencies involved in ownership and implementation of these infrastructure codes. In regards of the implementation deficit being driven by a lack of sustained government will, what we mean there is that governments tend to fear the rising cost of construction with the implementation of building codes, and that's not necessarily true. However, the fears perpetuate. There's also a fear of continuous time and effort involved to educate the society in uptaking these codes, because that has to be a sustained effort. We also believe that a lack of government will is driven by a fear of insufficient quality infrastructure services in the member states, such as product testing and product certification. And that is not necessarily true. And then finally, we think that a lack of the sustained government will comes because governments feel or they don't want to address the under-resourcing of their regulatory agencies. On the aspect of the lack of national coordination committees for agencies involved in the ownership and implementation of infrastructure codes, the weakness there is that in each member state, different agencies are involved in owning these national building codes and in implementing them. So the only sustainable solution for that is to form a national committee where you bring these organizations together on a very periodic basis. In some member states, you have the Ministry of Public Works that owns it and implements it. In other member states, it's the Ministry of Planning or the Ministry of Land Use or the Bureau of Standards, or even the Ministry of Local Governments. So that's why we think that having a good national coordinating committee that brings together these agencies on a regular basis is an important step. So in summary, Ron, we honestly believe that the perpetuation of the vulnerability risk is because there's an implementation deficit in implementing national building and infrastructure codes, and that's really driven by a lack of sustained government will to get it done, which we feel is solvable, and a lack of a national coordination committee for agencies involved in the ownership and implementation of these codes. Again, that is solvable. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Derek. We want to know, turn our attention to hear from Daniel. We're focusing on challenges, and you work certainly in one of the regional IFIs. From your lens, what are the challenges and the opportunities that you face in trying to address the exposure to critical infrastructure and to advance programs and projects that are seeking to alleviate these problems?
Thanks so much, Chair Ron, and also good day to my fellow panelists and all those joining us online. And thanks to the ICDR and the Government of India for this opportunity. You know, in beginning, Ron, I'd like to align myself with some of the comments made by our keynote speaker this morning, well, today. In terms of the first big challenge for our region, of course, is the physical infrastructure and services in our region are subject to multiple natural hazards and more frequent and intense extreme weather events we're seeing occurring in our region. I won't go into detail. I think ASG Slater did a great job in just laying out what we experienced over 2017 and in 2019. What I would say, however, is that climate projections point to increased intensity of extreme hydrometeorological events, such as hurricanes and intense rainfall in our region. We live essentially, climate-wise, in a tough neighborhood. Category 4 and 5 hurricanes will likely increase, and some projections show that sea level rise can reach by as much as 1 meter by 2100, the year 2100. So these projections suggest that disaster risks and impacts will have catastrophic effects on the Caribbean over the 21st century. That would be the first challenge that we face in the Caribbean. The other one would be poor infrastructure quality. While there is significant investment in the infrastructure, because of the significant debt burden and lack of fiscal space in many of our sovereigns in the region, the level of infrastructure investment is not where it needs to be, and certainly the level of investment in maintenance. Our governments are faced with very difficult and tough competing priorities, and as a result of that, the requisite level of routine maintenance on some key areas of infrastructure, we don't see that happening. In addition, given the small size of most of our islands, critical infrastructure is unavoidably often built in disaster risk-prone areas, such as near coastlines or in floodplains or near riverbanks, as the case might be, as there are unfortunately limited alternatives in many cases for safer areas. There's also, and this is one that we see quite a bit from the MDB perspective, the multilateral development banking perspective within SIDS and certainly within the Caribbean, weak capacity for improving infrastructure resilience. There's limited human resources with the adequate skills to facilitate mainstreaming disaster risk management and climate resilience into infrastructure development and investment. There's also a dearth of reliable data and information to risk-inform adequate infrastructure design and retrofitting. my good friend Derek in his opening remarks, I think brilliantly outlined the fact that we also face with some challenges as it relates to legislation and regulatory framework that are somewhat outdated without adequate consideration for climate and disaster risk. Most of our infrastructure in the region was built for climatic conditions that no longer exist. We live in a new climatic norm. And so we see insufficient investment in resilient infrastructure due to the limited resources and several urgent priorities our governments face. Which brings me to the opportunities, because I don't see it as all doom and gloom. I think we are in a crisis situation, but there are opportunities. The first would be to develop and maintain strong partnerships. I am quite pleased to be on this panel with these distinguished individuals, because the Caribbean Development Bank has strong partnerships with everyone here, with CrossQ, with CRIF, and certainly with SEDEMA, and of course with the CARICOM Secretariat. So the importance of sharing of information across the region through strong partnerships is key. The other one is the importance of mobilizing adequate financing for climate and disaster resilience of critical infrastructure. I'm pleased to say that through the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Partnership Fund, which has seen the United Kingdom place 300 million pounds under the management of the Caribbean Development Bank for transformational projects within the Caribbean region. Is this level of concessional resourcing that is needed to drive infrastructure resilience within the region? There's also the opportunity to provide expertise to design climate and disaster resilient infrastructure. And again, this will be catalyzed by concessional resource, and I'll speak a little bit more about that if given the opportunity later. But the expertise, whether housed residing within the region or extra regionally, is important. If we are to come out of this pandemic more resilient, now is the time to consider how we build forward, as you said, better. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to build local and national and regional institutional capacity, not just in terms of the human capital that is in some of our institutions, but the structure of our institutions and the ability for them to access climate and disaster financing on the global scale. I think there's also a significant opportunity to embrace innovative technologies in infrastructure design and operation. And you mentioned one of the sections we're going to be dealing with is solutions. So perhaps we can unpack that then. But I think that could be a cost-effective way in which we integrate climate change, mitigation and adaptation interventions through the use of leading-edge technology into critical infrastructure in the region, and hence provide us with an opportunity to leapfrog into the future. I'll stop there for now, but as I said, I don't see all doom and gloom. I see opportunities for our region to move forward stronger and better. Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Quite a bit there. I mean, I think we're going to get a chance to unpack some of those in the next round for sure. For Isaac, you are at the forefront of some of the innovative approaches, certainly in terms of financing. From your lens, what are some of the challenges you've experienced in advancing the financing arrangement? We use the term risk financing. Certainly you are in the risk transfer realm, but talk to us about the challenges you've come across in this unique region based on some of the things you've heard from your colleague panelists.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. There are really many risk transfer and financing challenges that I would say that are unique to developing states. In fact, you would have heard from our distinguished keynote speaker who highlighted one of the key challenges of SIDS, and that is in SIDS not being able to qualify for concessional financing on fair terms. Now, while many of those countries are classified as middle income by virtue of their per capita income, they are just as vulnerable as those countries that are classified as low income. In other words, they face the same disasters. And again, one do recall, just to use an example, Bahamas, which was pulverized by Hurricane Dorian quite recently. Which was a major superstorm, but yet still that particular country would be classified as middle income and therefore would be deprived of much needed concessional financing. So clearly that's one of the challenges, as I said, that was highlighted by the keynote speaker. But let me share some others that many of the small and coastal states in the Caribbean and also Central America, which is also served by CRIF, face. First and foremost, those countries are faced with many fiscal challenges. For example, we have the low growth prospect, which have been made even worse by the advent of COVID-19. We also have the high debt to GDP ratios, which really represents in a way a stranglehold on the development of those countries. Because what we actually see happening is that those countries are obviously impacted by those very frequent disasters, hurricanes, and so on. So they have to be constantly borrowing just to keep up, thus depriving them the ability to be able to borrow for other critical elements of development. So achieving debt to GDP sustainable is obviously a big challenge. We also need to understand that in the Caribbean, the number of disasters, as I said, while they're increasing, the cost of recovery is also of those disasters are also increasing. Look at what happened again with Dominica, which was impacted by Hurricane Maria in 2017. The cost of that single event was put at $1.3 billion US. And at the same time, the growth in the development assistance in disaster risk reduction has been moderate, and I think Daniel has already highlighted some of the issues there. What we are actually seeing with respect to development assistance for disaster risk reduction, for example, is a small fraction of the overall development assistance and spending on disaster remains largely exposed. The other point that I want to highlight is that the international studies have shown that for every dollar spent on disaster mitigation, it saves from $4 to $11. However, in the region, there is really no robust conclusion on how much a dollar spent on disaster risk reduction can save, exactly by conducting cost-benefit analysis for early warning systems or disaster risk reduction initiatives. There still exists a large, or a lack, I would say, of comprehensive understanding between disaster risk reduction and disaster risk financing, or risk transfer, with many officials not adequately recognizing that regardless of the investment in disaster risk reduction, there will always be a residual risk. So what you hear coming up all the time is, why should, for example, you buy insurance when you can use that money, to improve the infrastructure and so on, not recognizing that regardless of the amount of resources that you actually put in disaster risk reduction, there will always be a residual risk that you need to mitigate, and that's where those sort of instruments comes in. It is therefore fiscally prudent for governments to transfer a portion of risk to an entity such as CRIF. I must admit that through our efforts, as well as those of our development partners, like the Caribbean Development Bank, like CDMA and so on, there has been much improvement in the understanding of disaster risk financing. Unfortunately, there is still a widespread misconception of insurance, and I must admit that has been helped by a number of unfortunate events and other risk transfer mechanism and how these instruments actually work. In fact, up to now, some countries still prefer to self-insure, which has clearly has, while it is important for countries and for organizations to do some element of self-insurance, it is important that they understand the merit in actually transferring some of that risk. The whole question about adequacy of financing for post-disaster recovery continues to be a big problem. I mean, we again, just to use the example of Dominica, with a 1.3 billion US dollar price tag on Hurricane Irma. Where is this money coming from? You know, and clearly, in fact, I do recall an official in the Ministry of Finance saying to me that, you know, almost a year after that particular event, the only resources that they received from any external agency was from CRIF. CRIF was able to make a payout to the government of Dominica amounting to about 20 million US dollars within 14 days. Now, while that was very much welcome in terms of helping the country in terms of its immediate recovery and so on, the reality is that 20 million US dollars will never be enough to deal with the overwhelming cost of rebuilding. So clearly, it is important for us to identify other instruments that would certainly help address the financing needs of the countries. The other point that I want to touch on very quickly is just the whole notion of the protection gap and closing that protection gap, which continues to be a big problem. Interestingly, not only in SIDS, but it's a global problem. In fact, I mean, worldwide, as much as 70% of economic losses arising from natural disasters, you know, are uninsured, with the protection gap being much wider in SIDS. Now, unfortunately, what we have also seen is that increasing growth levels, as in pre-COVID times, did not necessarily translate to a reduction or closing in that gap, certainly in the Caribbean and Central America. So, I mean, there are so many challenges, but again, I would certainly like to take my cue from Daniel Best in saying that while those challenges exist, they're not necessarily insurmountable. And I think that is where I would get the opportunity to explain to you a little bit eventually about, for example, the role of CRIF and other types of disaster risk transfer mechanism. But let me close by saying that it must be understood that a critical element in the resilience equation is the availability of financing. And it is therefore important that we find, I mean, ways and means of overcoming the financing challenge. And I should also say as a region, and it really calls for a collective working together to be able to find those solutions to those common problems. I would stop here for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isaac. Very interesting. The protection gap issue is certainly one that we want to look at. Panelists, permit me, I'm going to try and sort of get us back on time. You know, we've initially planned to have 3 rounds. I'm going to be creative. I'm going to ask that we meld the last 2 rounds into one. We're going to look now at some of these solutions. What is your top line solution from your angle? So I'm abandoning a little bit, you know, my suite of questions that I'm going to pose to you, but still, you know, being true. So first, for Derek, what's your top line message in terms of a solution, and you know, what in the way of an approach you see we can take to cause that solution to be applied?
We think the primary solution is lodged in government policy if collective will and also regional coordination or national coordination of the agencies involved is important. So we believe that a national policy recommendation that sees more efficient and effective implementation of building regulations would be important as our primary solution. We would like to see more efficient and effective building regulations, like Daniel was saying, that supports climate change adaptations by adjusting building sightings, designs, and construction requirements to more frequent and extreme hazards. We would like to see more efficient and effective building regulations in that it would require those regulations to more support climate change mitigation by curbing carbon dioxide emissions through improved energy efficiency mechanisms. Thirdly, we'd like to see more appropriate building regulations, like Isaac was saying, that promotes investment by contributing to reducing risk in private sector participation in buildings and resilience infrastructure. And finally, we'd like to see building regulations that have inherently built into them an embedded perpetual campaign of raising stakeholder awareness of the value of using codes and the cheaper aspect of taking the costs up front rather than at the end. So in terms of a solution, we would see policy recommendations that address those 4 areas. And also, too, that should be accompanied by an enabling environment that has more robust legal and institutional architectures, that has more effective regulatory institutions, and that has more internationally recognized quality infrastructure services available to the regulatory institutions to implement this legal and institutional architecture. Now, in the first instance of an enabling environment with a better legal and institutional architecture, we'd love to see governments, when they implement these building regulations, that they follow good regulatory practice as outlined by the WTO agreements, and that they clearly identify who are the sectorial regulators and an efficient regulatory cooperation framework and network. In the area of the regulators themselves, we think it's not hard for governments to better resource their regulators in the area of manpower, equipment, and work methods. All those things can be done with just better will and coordination. And then that will enable the regulators to better do their jobs of inspection, supervision, and encouraging compliance, or even going to the ultimate end of enforcement. And finally, we would love to see the building regulatory environment really embrace quality infrastructure services and supporting their bureaus of standards to have more relevant and up-to-date codes and practices in the building regulatory environment, and also to having and encouraging more accredited testing laboratories in the area of construction works, and the certification of not only products to quality standards, but the certification of personnel who are able to implement those quality standards. So for us, in terms of solutions, we see in a more effective and efficient building regulatory environment that embraces climate change in a very real way and encourages the private sector involvement by reducing risk. And we think that an enabling environment for implementing that policy would be around more coordinated and better resourced regulators and a legal framework. And finally, a better and more focused quality infrastructure development with testing labs and certification systems for quality as driven by the bureaus of standards.
Thank you very much, Derek. Certainly a message around, again, picking up on that issue around partnership, but central to that are critical stakeholders like the private sector, working with government to drive this legislative and capacity building environment. Daniel, from your lens, you outlined quite a number of things, and you really pivoted to a positive future. within that, you may have some solutions that are right on the tip of your finger that you would like to unpack for us a little bit, and probably speak to how do you see that within the realm of the resources you currently command. You spoke to the UK fund. How do you see that as an opportunity, as a catalyst for some of those solutions that you referenced?
Thanks so much. Ron, since we're being kindly hosted by the government of India and ICDR, you would permit me a cricketing analogy. I think most of our guests will know we, as a West Indies team, were more successful when we had a four-pronged pace attack. And the solution has to be multi-pronged. I think Derek began that, and I'm not going to rehash what he spoke to with respect to the regulatory framework. I want to move, if I could add a rider onto that and move forward. Let's talk, for instance, then about financing. Climate and disaster risk need to be systematically incorporated in project design. And what does that mean? This entails undertaking climate and disaster risk screening and in-depth risk assessment based on the findings of risk screenings at the design stage. And that is one of the things that we have done, taken a decision at the Caribbean Development Bank. All projects funded by CDB go through extensive climate risk screening. So resourcing such as that received from the UKSF, the Caribbean Infrastructure Partnership Fund, facilitates the early stage climate risk screening and building it into the design. The other point here, which you'd hear coming up, is that of implementation and the challenges we face. It is important to consider the institutional capacity for project management and implementation even prior to design, and seek to catalyze climate resources wherever possible to bolster the institutional capacity in our implementing agencies by providing them with the requisite training and sufficiently assessing their skill sets and engaging individuals who can support them in the implementation process. I also want to speak to the scale at which individual climate finance contributions are made. And I know this is a thorny issue, but it is one that we need to bring to the forefront. It is a key determinant of whether they can be allocated for large transformational initiatives. For the Caribbean region, it is important for us to start to move beyond a project-based approach. And I know that may sound strange coming from me as the director of projects, but the fact of the matter is that given the, for want of a better term, ad hoc nature in which climate financing sometimes comes based on either the reliability, the gestation period for approval with some of the larger donors, larger global donors in the climate finance space, governments struggle to program resources over a consistent 5 to 10 year period for building resilience. And we've spoken about bringing the private sector on board, and I'm happy that Derek brought that on, because when governments program over a 5-year period with the vision that climate finance resources gained from the international community could leverage private sector involvement, if those resources aren't timely in coming, it then results in that budget allocation going elsewhere. And the crisis in the Caribbean that we face is sufficient, is so urgent that we can't afford delays in the scale of resources reaching our shore. So we need to develop a more programmed approach for channeling resources. And Ron, the last thing I want to touch on here in terms of the importance of concessional resourcing. We have, as I mentioned earlier, worked with CrossQ, SEDIMA, and the OECS in the past, and we are currently working now with them in terms of developing a regional application document for the international building codes. We're also working with artisan training because, as I said, it's a multi-pronged approach. There's a financing approach, there's a regulatory approach, but the average homeowner cannot afford to go to a bona fide contractor. And so they'll go to maybe the father-in-law or the uncle or a friend. it's important that these artisans are appropriately trained. And then the last point I want to touch on is that of testing. Derek mentioned it, but we're currently using grant resources under the European Partnership Agreement, Caribbean Single Market and Economy Standby Facility to enhance the capacity of countries within our region to offer calibration and testing services that will support key sectors such as construction and manufacturing. Why is that important? Well, some of the notable benefits of that is that we will be developing metrology labs in these countries, thereby ensuring accurate and comparable results by making test and measurement results traceable. It also assists domestic suppliers to build trust with other participants in the global value chain. So you see, it is interconnected. And finally, in terms of solutions and approaches around the use of technology, I know I touched on it earlier, but we can't say it enough. Alternate building systems. I mean, such as structural insulated panels and insulated concrete forms, which has already been started to be used in some of our countries, such as Trinidad and Belize, which combine energy efficiency, comfort, and resilience. And there's a gender aspect to this. These forms tend to be lightweight, which can also be handled by women and younger persons. So, and I'm not saying, of course, in any way that women can't handle heavier forms, but I'm saying that has too often been used as a flagpost as to why we can't hire women on this side or that side, and that's nonsense. And we're saying the technology out there allows fully gender equality even within the construction sector in building resilience. And then, of course, your homeland of Jamaica, incorporating intelligent transport systems. The Jamaica Intelligent Transport System is a revolutionary way to monitor and manage all road networks in Jamaica. This is something that can be rolled out across multiple sectors and across many of our member states, of our countries, such that response time to disasters, to natural hazards, can be significantly shortened. So, I think, as I said, you may hear the passion in my voice because I'm excited about what happens next, but we need the concessional resourcing to make it happen. Thanks a lot, Chair.
Brilliant, Daniel. I mean, quite a lot there again. I mean, I don't know. We're very grateful for the space from the Indian government, but this is really rich in content and, deserves another half an hour even though we don't have it. Isaac, so we've heard, about all of the innovation that's going on in different spaces, the opportunities that are there, the positive outlook that you and Daniel shared. From your lens, I mean, where do you see solutions in closing this protection gap? I mean, you talked quite extensively around, risk transfer and knowing a little bit more about it and bridging that challenge. But what are the solutions you see ahead, building on where you are now, as Chris, but in particular, you've singled out this issue with the protection gap. Talk to us a little bit about that and how do you see us getting around that?
Absolutely, Ronald. The first thing I would like to say is that we must never underestimate the ability of our people, of our regions, to be able to get common solutions to common problems. And I mean, when I really look back, I think how CRIF came into being is, for me, an excellent example of this. This was, in a sense, a sort of homegrown solution. It was started off by the governments following Hurricane Ivan in the year 2004, which devastated a number of countries, particularly Grenada, Cayman Islands, causing losses of almost $8 billion US. It was really a wake-up call for these governments of the Caribbean who decided to approach the World Bank and with the support of the donor community and as well as the reinsurance market came to establish this risk facility, which emerged as the world's first multi-country risk pool based on parametric insurance. And the whole idea is to be able to provide quick liquidity to the countries in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. When we started off operations, we started off with earthquake provisions for earthquake tropical cyclone, we added excess rainfall. And interestingly, last year, we are able to launch a product design for the transmission and distribution infrastructure of utility companies, which we launched successfully last year. And the year before, we were also able to launch a product for coast designed specifically for the fishery sector. And again, the whole idea is to provide that level of protection, not only to livelihoods, but also to the infrastructure. So what we have now seen is that with the establishment of CRIF, we are seeing the opportunity to add even more innovation. So, I mean, one of the things that we are currently working, and we have started a collaboration with the Caribbean Development Bank on the creation or development of a index-based parametric insurance product for the agricultural sector. You would know, Ron, that one of the problems that has plagued the region is the risk in agriculture, all right? And while there have been various experiments with respect to protection and so on, those have failed. And that is because they were not really properly structured and so on. So we are now seeing, with the advent of insurance, parametric insurance, we're seeing an opportunity to be able to provide a solution there. So the first thing that I would really like to say is that let us build on that success. Let us see how we could optimize the value of what we do. And the other thing is that we also need to explore other disaster risk financing instruments. I mean, I'm pleased to see some of the work that the governments are doing, particularly Jamaica, St. Lucia, in terms of disaster risk finance framework that they have put in place. And they are looking to see how they could introduce other instruments, because they understand that no single instrument can help you achieve the required resources. Insurance will not do it alone. Loans from the CDB is not going to be enough, you know. So we do have to look at cat bonds and so on. And I'm pleased to see what the government of Jamaica is doing, where they are prepared to launch a cat bond to help them provide that much needed resources. But I would like to see the region go much further than that. I think we can actually develop or establish a regional cat bond facility, even using the CRIF facility. We have actually done cat bonds through the World Bank, but there's no reason that we cannot do more. So, you know, the point I want to make is that there's just so many opportunities right now in the space of innovation to be able to help countries release and find the much needed resources in order to be able to respond to the various disasters. I mean, there's so much more that I can say, but I realize we do have a time constraint.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I said, I mean, this is really, really rich. I'm hoping we can probably, you know, talk with CDRI, have probably a follow-up webinar in their webinar series at some point. Sandrick, I hope I'm not pushing the boundaries, but this is quite rich. We have a lot of questions coming in. We're battling with time. I want to hear from Sadim. I want to hear from our discussant on all that she has heard today, and really giving us a reflection as our panelists seek to unpack from challenges to solutions, looking at opportunities and approaches. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and sincere thanks as well to the Government of India and the ICDRI for the invitation. I want to give my sincere greetings to you, firstly, and to my esteemed panel colleagues and the diverse participants who are joining us today. It has indeed been a very rich conversation. As you can see, I've been taking copious notes and certainly won't have the time to explore this richness in the time that has been allocated for this discourse. But let me just take a few minutes, I would say, to reflect on some of the messages that I have heard and to add Sidima's contribution to that conversation. One of the first messages I think that we have heard from the panelists is that the Caribbean is multi-hazard in nature, but strategic actions are also being advanced. As one of the panelists indicated, we live in a tough neighborhood. And I will also add that we have new norms that are emerging. The history of economic and social dislocation that is resulting from the impacts of a diversity of hazards in the Caribbean is significant, from earthquakes to cyclones, tropical cyclones, volcanic eruptions, and floods. And since 1950, we have had 511 disasters worldwide, hitting small states with developing economies. And of these, 324 are in the Caribbean. And the current COVID-19 pandemic is reinforcing the susceptibility of the region to biological hazards. We also note that according to the CRED report on economic losses, poverty, and disasters, that 40% of the top 10 climate-related disasters for absolute losses over the last 20 years, that's 4 out of 10, these events affected the Caribbean countries. That's Irma, Maria, Ike, and Ivan. So this is the tough neighborhood really that we live in. And we recognize that we have those new norms that are emerging. We have these biological hazards, we have the COVID-19. But we do have strategic actions that are being advanced. We have heard already about our comprehensive disaster management strategy, 2014 to 2024, and the companion 2018 resilience framework, known as the Pathway for Resilience, and its 5 pillars, one of which focuses on safeguarding infrastructure. But notably, this cannot be divorced from 2 other pillars that are also under the resilience framework, which is enhancing economic opportunity, because we've talked about the financing issues, as well as operational readiness and recovery. Together, these provides the opportunity for real relevance to this conversation in advancing the agenda. And so we would want to say that we have a good foundation in the region for being able to advance and to address the issues that are before us. So we need to give greater attention to them. The second matter that I think that we have heard is the whole matter of risk governance, institutional arrangements, and accelerating implementation. At CDEMA, we recognize that the nature of risk is systemic, and we need to move away from the traditional idea that events are isolated, and hence there's a need for systemic risk governance to appropriately match the nature of systemic risks. In that context, the CDM approach, which advances all hazards, all phases, and all peoples as we seek to achieve resilience in an integrated manner, includes the promotion of intersectoral approaches. We've talked about the involvement of various sectors, including the private sector, etc., and all peoples in this agenda, and all hazards. And this also supports the Sendai Framework for Disasters Reduction. So in that context, this network approach to risk governance is inherent to the CDM approach. As such, as we move forward, we need to see better institutional arrangements, as well as accelerating implementation, which can be possible with better will and coordination, as indicated by one of our panelists. And within the built environment, we need to see significant changes within the building regulations, which address climate change and involve the private sector. And this is in keeping with priority area 3 of the CDM, which is looking at mainstreaming CDM into key sectors. There are several more, but I will highlight particularly 2 at this time. The whole matter of financing. We've heard the messages that resources are insufficient, they're unpredictable, they are ad hoc, and they're not really programmed. So we do need to look at a better programming approach to to financing. We talked about the concessional financing, such as the cat bonds, etc. Under the CDM, we do have the institutional strengthening, priority area 1, where we are seeking to address the matter of having adequate resourcing for CDM implementation. And I do think that there is a lot of investment that countries are making to reduce risk, but that's not fully captured. And this is something that we actually need to address better. I also want you to permit me, because I think it would be remiss of me not to address the whole matter of reparatory justice. We know that this is aimed at the national and international reconciliation, given the history of the Caribbean. And this agenda is being very much pushed and being advanced. But in this agenda, there is the issue of debt cancellation for our small island developing states of the Caribbean, or BOSS, as we want to certainly refer to them at this time. is debt cancellation, but the other issue is the whole matter of the establishment of a fund which would allow us to achieve our development aspirations. And I think that this is something that has to be on this agenda if we're talking about having financing that would actually address the issues that we have. I know we've talked about risk-informed planning and design, which is also in keeping with the CDM priority area 2 on knowledge management, where we're seeking to look at risk-informed decision-making and the whole issues of technology, which is a cross-cutting theme. And we don't have time to fully explore all of these, but I think, and I want to support your intervention, Chair, of probably having, another conversation on this. But I want to take the opportunity here to just put a little bit of a nugget here. And it really is in this whole conversation as we seek to address the infrastructure. In fact, the typology of hazards affecting the Caribbean region does suggest that infrastructure, but in particular housing, is most at threat. In the Caribbean region, with our history, in our landscape, houses were not really designed to withstand anything. They were designed really to move and to move quickly. And if we are able to address the matter of safer housing in the Caribbean, we've talked about the building codes, etc. That has come up. If we are able to address the whole matter of safer housing, we would be able to change this whole agenda significantly for us. Because when we talk about housing, we're not only talking about economic losses, but there is a social dimension that is really associated with this as well. And so this needs to be treated with in a very direct way. In fact, if you look at the losses emerging from major events, spanning from when CDEMA was established in CDERA as CDEMA was established in 1991, and coming forward from the volcanic emergency in 1995 to 97, Ivan in Grenada in 2004, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, Irma Maria 2017, with its impacts on the British Virgin Islands, Barbuda, and Dominica. This has been a real issue. And so this is a matter that has to be treated not only because of the economic and development aspirations, but also the social dimensions when we look at infrastructure and we relate to housing. And I will rest there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Really good. Colleagues, we're out of time, but I have to really offer a space to our participants. And I have a lot of questions. I'm gonna pick 2 of them, and I'm gonna ask that you in 1 minute, each panel touch this. There's one, you can choose which one. One which asks, from the point of view of the technical standards for critical infrastructure in the Caribbean and trying to improve them and enhance resilience, which sector would you recommend to be prioritized for investment? Which sector would you pick? Looking at the Caribbean itself, which one of the sectors would you prioritize for investment in resilience from an infrastructure standpoint? And the second question is, what is the role of the end user? I mean, we've talked about these barriers, we've talked about we've talked about what is the role of the end user and the general public in pushing countries to adopt a resilient infrastructure, fast tracking and accelerating that, as you said. Derek, you want to touch one? If you don't, you can say pass.
Yeah, so for us, we've been working closely with CDB, CDEMA, and the OECS Commission in looking at the informal housing sector. Because like Andrea said, where we come from, houses were meant to move. Now they have to be stationary. So we need to find a way to upscale the informal to the formal, because maybe close to about 70% of our building stock in the Caribbean is housing, and out of that 70%, maybe another 50% or more is informal. So that's what we're looking at. And the other part of it, in terms of the end user, it requires a lot of education for them to realize that it's cheaper to invest in a more resilient housing now, rather than have to face the cost of repair and recovery and rehabilitation later. but you know, necessity has its own laws.
Sir Ambassador Slater, you have to leave. You want to pick a sector as you run off?
um, well, I already start switching my head to other issues.
Okay. Okay. No.
COVID, but I concur with Derek. And so let me really quickly say thank you to all of you. As I stated in my chat, it has been very engaging, and I really do hope that there are a lot of persons listening to the stream. I particularly was hooked on Daniel's presentation and some of the metaphors of cricket and so on, but we really have to go at an all out attack. Our Indian colleagues, however, might want to challenge us on that. We don't have the attack we used to have, Daniel. Nonetheless, but seriously though, I hope that we really have this discussion has been well disseminated, because it's will be done.
It's on YouTube.
This session.
It's on YouTube, so we're able to disseminate it.
But it's really, and don't forget, colleagues, that we are at the not too far away from June, when we are entering into the season that all of us have been speaking about. And we didn't even touch issues of volcano. We have a member state right now facing that. Well, not touch, but we didn't go into details, but there are so many things. But really, I have to run.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, everybody. Good.
Thank you, Ambassador. Colleagues, I'm gonna wrap now. I'm mindful of our host and the time it is in New Delhi and in India, you know. But I do take the call that we may have to revisit some of the very important points raised. Not simply because we shouldn't only see ourselves as victims, but also as sometimes the architect of our own future. And Daniel, Isaac, Andrea, and I think Derek outlined quite a bit of solutions, some positive things that are unfolding in the region that we need to upscale, we need to accelerate, and the opportunities that are presented there. So today we heard perspectives from innovation, the importance of partnerships in advancing infrastructure resilience, the engagement of key stakeholders, which must play a part in this process, including the role of the end users, the network approach and its importance for risk governance, the need to look at will, whether we want to call it political will, whether we want to call it individual will, and the importance of coordinating in a space of very limited resources, the need to change the sort of elements in the built environment. And I know Andrea raised the point of the housing sector. When Sedera was created, there was a target of reducing the vulnerability of the housing stock by 80%. And we still recognize that this is still certainly a challenge that we have to tackle. And the role of risk informing in the development process, risk informing development for decision making. These are all important things that came out, financing or programming approaches, and looking at this whole issue of reparatory justice and debt cancellation. A big issue, a big talking point that I think will continue going forward. Colleagues, I want to thank you very much for participating, for answering the call, and really enlivening the debate and the discourse. More is yet to be shared, and we're hoping we will get an opportunity to do so. I want to thank the Government of India and the Director General of CDRI and his entire team for providing a space for the Caribbean voice to be shared in this very important international gathering. Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you